welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your blessings from above host Madelyn.
I'm your death from below.
I should have done heavenly host. That would have been a good pun. Anyway, and thanks.
Yeah, it would have been funny.
Thanks for tuning into the show. This week, it's side quest time, and so we're going to be tackling a topic that definitely fits into an hour-long podcast. We're talking about religion and games and religion. It's my pick. So, how do we see games use religion and storytelling as mechanic? What kinds of religions or religious elements do we see? Is that new Jesus game that's coming out any good? All of that good stuff. Answer to the last question seems to be no, by the way. This episode was inspired by, I was originally thinking about doing games in history because, we talked about Age of Empires, and I'm still thinking about like that Band of Buddies history mashup game, and I just haven't quite landed it yet. But then I thought to myself, no, Madelyn, it's December. The most
That was your inspiration?
Truly, yes. I was
His
really
birth is coming soon.
We
must celebrate.
I was like, it's the holiday season, so what's a more Talk This holiday celebration than, we could have done like a holiday gift guide, I guess, but that would have been boring. So instead we're doing like Assassin's Creed and I Am Jesus Christ and God of War. Happy holidays from Talk This.
Exciting.
And it was not inspired by the release of the I Am Jesus Christ game demo prologue, but I did see that article about it like later in the day when we set this topic and felt that really validated. It's like a sign from above that I'd made the right decision.
Also, Persona 3 Portable. Coming to modern systems and PC. It's already the Jesus game. You don't need another one.
Look, in this game, as we were talking about before we turned on the microphones, you put Satan in his place. First person.
I wonder how they gamify the crucifixion.
Well, the loading screen is already like the crown of thorns.
That's good.
If you haven't watched any of the like trailers or like the demo, like IGN has like a playthrough of like 10 minutes of the demo, it's worth a peek. It's worth a look. It's so interesting. It's like enough effort has gone into this game that like someone is developing it, it's a real game.
Didn't they say the same developer's done like, did a Moses game already?
Oh, did they really? I didn't know that.
At the bottom of the article, and they're making like a simulation one for building Noah's Ark.
I love that. That actually I can get behind. Like a builder sim for Noah's Ark. That's a dope idea. I do want to read. I really appreciated this one particular quote from the developer of I Am Jesus Christ before I move on to other things. Which is, it's from an interview with him on Vice, and the paragraph goes, unfortunately for the developers, though, it also has ridiculously high meme potential. Quote, we already had that problem with our trailers, but ... somebody needs to make such a game, replied the lead developer when I asked him whether he was worried about what the internet would do with his work.
Yeah. Somebody has to do it.
Look, it's one of the rare occasions where I recommend on any given story that you go down and read the comments, because there's some good stuff down there.
He's just, that's what happened to Jesus. They didn't believe in his vision.
Oh man. We're already, I'm already ready to pull out the Abed episode of Community Reference, and we're only, 2 minutes into the show. Anyway, a first-person Jesus simulator sounds fun.
The first-personness really threw me off. I was like, why is this first person?
And it has such big Skyrim energy, too, when, the hands show up doing the magic. Yeah. It's like, this is the Elder Scrolls. It's really funny. And like there's like collectibles. I don't know if they're collectibles or if they just pop up as you reach different areas that are like Bible verses. It's like it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating, and you should check it out. But Emma, I feel like you, despite this being my idea, really led the research for this podcast.
I guess so.
I don't know. You seem like to be deeply inspired by recently completing Pentiment, right?
Yeah. I did just finish Pentiment. I talked about it. I hadn't finished it on the 6-week show. But I've finished it now. And I think that's probably the only game I've played that deals with like religion in like a real historical way. Or even like I don't think I've really played any like games, like modern set games where religion was like a big deal at all. Either. So in terms of like actual representation of like Christianity, just Pentiment, I think.
Yeah, that's something that kind of surprised me exactly, but it surprised me to have my assumptions confirmed. Like, I sort of figured I would start researching and it would be like, no, like, there are games that are, like, about Christianity that aren't like I Am Jesus Christ, and you're just not aware of them.
I think there's a ton of games that are soaked in Christian aesthetics to a certain extent. But a lot of the time, like there's always like the church in JRPGs, and like they're almost always clearly inspired by like Catholic cathedrals and stuff, but it's not Christianity in the game either in localized or in the original. In which there might be some references to God in which those are changed in older games when they're brought over here. But it's not usually like, oh, your characters are going to like Christian church and doing Christian things. They're just sort of in the aesthetics of Catholicism. But, there's like the All Father or the All Mother or whatever, some made up God that they worship.
It is interesting to me, though, that, particularly and we'll talk, I guess, about the Horizon series later, but it's interesting to me that there's not more of this sort of, like, religious element in, the whole post-apocalyptic Earth. Like, there's some of it, it appears in Fallout, it appears in BioShock, it appears in Horizon. But I will be curious, given the direction of U.S. politics over the past few years, if we start to see more like even subtle jabs at Christianity in Western games, because it's very hard to find. It's very hard to find anything other than like Assassin's Creed, which is obviously historical.
Yeah.
And it gives me a new perspective on, when we talked about Binding of Isaac, when was that, like a year ago or so now? Something like that. I thought all of the uproar around it was really silly, right? Especially having, like, the game is stupid. Like, yeah, it does depict his, like, fundamentalist mother kind of badly, and there's a lot of poop everywhere, and, like, some references to abortion, and so, like, I understand the controversy from certain groups on that front, but the like it's blasphemous kind of label that got slapped on it at the time, I was like, whatever, man, like it's this like 5th grade jokes level blasphemy here. But seeing the actual landscape it goes into, it's like, oh, like that does make a little more sense given that there's like actually no representation on the other side. Anyway, I shouldn't talk about Binding of Isaac too much because it'll tempt me to download it again in these trying times.
That can't happen, no.
It is one of, maybe let's talk about JRPGs and killing God, but it is, you mentioned in our notes, like this idea of like are there any Western games, like with JRPGs, it's such a trope, right? It's like, it's a JRPG. At the end, you're going to kill God, right? And that's, not usually like capital G God of the Judeo-Christian faith, at least literally. But it's a meme.
Unless it's SMT, and where that, I think a lot of that meme comes from, the attack and dethrone God. You can kill God in all of those. That's the Judeo-Christian God. Or Satan. You can also kill Satan.
Fair enough. But you are right, I think, to point out that there really aren't... It's interesting, right? There aren't very many Western games that even tackle that from the generic killing God at the end kind of thing. That instead the West is, like, obsessed with Greek mythology.
I mean, I think it's an interesting thing of, like, playing with things that are not actually, like, not yours in a certain extent.
Yeah.
Like, Japan has Christianity, obviously, but is not, like, Christmas is a thing they celebrate, but it's like a romantic holiday. At least that's how they portray it in media. It's not like our Lord and Savior over there. And obviously mythology, like, there's still some practitioners of certain mythologies, of course, but it's not something that we do in the US, really. So it's interesting that we're like, I don't want to touch. We're over here, we're like, we don't actually want to touch the things that we actually worship.
Exactly. But that makes Binding of Isaac that much more notable, because in Binding of Isaac, you do kill Satan, and you do fight literal angels and, like, the horsemen of the apocalypse and the 7 deadly sins, and, like, you fight, like, your angel self in a cathedral, right? You don't end up, it stops short of you literally fighting, like, Jesus Christ, although who knows, probably one day they'll release yet another round of DLC where you do in fact fight Jesus. But, like, you play, like, there are characters where it's like you can play as Eve, you can play as Cain, right? Like, that all is there. And so it's really rare, and it's like, well, you're not, maybe not quite killing God, but you are killing Satan, you are killing angels. Like, they're pretty close.
Yeah.
And I tried to throw Skyrim in there, and you were like, Jesus parallels are no good.
Yeah. I just, like, despite me joking about Persona 3 earlier, like, I think that a lot of games, because a lot of stories, made by people who at least were raised around churches, or just people who are storytellers in general, like, we just like biblical parallels sometimes, especially Jesus stories. Like, I think that just is gonna show up places, even if it's not really, like, a religious game,
Greatest story ever told.
Exactly.
But the only, like, there are, I guess, well, where am I going? Let's talk about JRPGs. I'll come back to Christianity. I'll give us a Christianity break. The Skyrim parallel, by the way, was to Talos, who is a god who started as a human and ascended to godhood, and there's a fight between the Empire and the Stormcloaks about whether you should be allowed to worship Talos. So, like, some Christian parallels there, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
But let's talk about JRPGs. Let's start with killing God, and then it'll seem much less offensive when we continue to make fun of first-person Jesus, probably, throughout. First-person Jesus who can run out of Holy Spirit, by the way. Sorry, I have to say that. Like, you have, like, a Holy Spirit gauge, and you can run out. So, like, these dudes can't decide what kind of game they're making here.
Yeah.
Anyway, JRPGs. Let's kill God.
So I think it's worth mentioning that while attack and dethrone God is the funnier catchword, there is, like, a distinct group of games, like, where you kill a god at the end, and ones where the church is bad.
Yeah.
And those are, like, distinct story types. So, like, in the Personas and SMT, you'll be killing, like, a god at the end, but they don't really deal with, like, churches necessarily.
Yeah.
Whereas in something like Tales or some Final Fantasies, you'll have stuff about churches. that is dealing with like the actual structure of a church and usually how it uses faith in like an oppressive way. You can look at Fire Emblem Three Houses. You also brought up in certain roots.
Fire Emblem Three Houses is super weird for this episode, I have to say. Fire Emblem Three Houses is like, maybe God is good. Or not.
Yeah.
You decide.
That's also kind of a Jesus game.
I look forward to your blog post about that.
Aren't you like imbued with the divinity, aren't you? So
yeah. I don't know if in the Bible it's like Jesus has a little girl inside of him.
It doesn't have to literally be like...
No, I know. Yeah, it does literally have the kind of like, you're dead for a while and then
you die and resurrect. Yeah.
Oh man, that's troubling. That's a particularly interesting take. It's like, you're Jesus, but you do kill God.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Anyway, yeah, Three Houses. Three Houses is like, once again, you're talking about, like, there's not too many JRPGs that depict the church in a positive way, I guess, before we get into killing God. More than that, but, like, it's, Dragon Quest, right? And even then, the churches in Dragon Quest are like save points sometimes. Like, they're not always like...
Yeah. I mean, you can receive... There's also, like, you get, like, benediction and prayer and stuff that can, like, heal your party and stuff, which... I mean, a lot of JRPGs also do have stuff like the pray move that heals your party, but, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So Fire Emblem Three Houses is sort of unique in that, in some roots, the church is maybe good.
It seems skeptical of like the church as a structure, but not in like individuals are bad. Yeah, that is what I would say about Fire Emblem Three Houses.
And if you really force it, I mean, plenty of people have written about religious elements in The Legend of Zelda. I feel like if you get to the cultural impact of something like The Legend of Zelda, somebody is going to write about the religious elements of it. Like, that's just not avoidable. And it's there, of course it's there, through like the Triforce and that kind of thing. But I feel like that is... something that I'm trying to avoid jumping too far off the deep end of this episode is like 100% fictional, like spiritual religion stuff in games. Like, I think that there's way, way, way more of that than we could possibly talk about. And when you get into stuff like the religious elements of the Triforce, it's like, okay, I hear you. Like, yeah, sure.
I mean, it is called the Triforce.
I mean, I know, but I don't think
that kind of does just lay it out there for you.
It's apparently based on something more Shinto, though, I think, is what I was reading.
That makes sense.
And so, like, yes, of course. Yeah, anytime there's three... Like, let's not even talk about the Trinity Marks in first Kingdom Hearts game.
Goofy is, of course, the father.
Sora's the son, Donald's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. I'm glad we agree.
Canon. You will find that in the Book of Kings.
Yeah.
Kings 1. 1 Kings.
In terms of depictions of the church, it's pretty... I would say in Cold Steel, it's pretty positive. The church is kind of shady, but like in a cool way. Like they're like cool fighters operating behind the scenes and stuff, So they're like hip. Shady in a hip way. Final Fantasy goes like back and forth on religion. I know in 10, it's bad. I don't know the specifics of it, but I know that it doesn't like religion in 10. It's made up religion. In 15, like the gods are like super uncaring and stuff, but there's religious figures like your Noctis's fiance is like the prophet, basically, who are like trying to keep the gods in line for humanity's sake. So it's sort of like the church like tries to order gods around is interesting. And I was actually like, I was really thinking about Final Fantasy VII is really interesting because they have like it's getting into more like spiritual religion stuff, but like the life stream is sort of like a religion. They talk about it like a religion, a little bit of believing in this life stream, and there's evidence of like an abandoned religion in like the church that Aerith is in. Right, but people don't go there anymore. It just happens to be there. And yet also in Remake you have like, you know, like the forces of fate that you must fight, you know?
Yeah.
That show up is sort of like it's still dealing with similar themes. Like it's like these more like spiritual elements are good and these more like predetermination elements are bad, right? And also the corporatism will stomp all over your faith anyway. There you could write a paper. You could write something on that. That'd be interesting.
I'm sure people already have.
I looked for a lot. I really did scour Google Scholar at least. You know, like what is this theme? Like, why does the church come up so often in JRPGs? Why does God come up so often in JRPGs, and why are they usually bad? And I was really surprised I couldn't find very much. I really thought that would be like a thing that people would be interested in researching, and I really couldn't find anything.
I know, I feel like Final Fantasy is usually such ripe ground for like academic articles on things. Like if you're looking for something, someone's written a paper through the lens of Final Fantasy on it. And it was surprising to me too, how little like actual, you know, whether scholarly or even sort of like critical analysis of it beyond like, haha, like we're killing God again kind of commentary.
Yeah, I did happen across a little bit of looking at Final Fantasy's use of various different mythological figures, right? Like from all over. They have these summons, right, that appear throughout their games that are pulled from many different religions. And it talked a little bit about like this idea of the codification of Shintoism really just being something that was sort of imposed down the line when really it was not really a unified system of worshiping things. It was just a bunch of like scattered stuff that people did in different areas that differed from each other, right? Because there's like thousands of gods and like little tiny shrines and stuff that you can worship at for various reasons. And that like playing with all of these different religions in sort of a non-worshipful way, a non-sacred way, kind of goes along with that because they just start throwing them in there, like, along with their chocobos. And, like, this sort of, you know, equivalent a little bit. Like, they're not particularly concerned with, I guess, being respectful of any particular divinity, I guess.
You're telling me
that's interesting. And I think you'd have to do a lot more research on that to speak definitively on it. I would. But I thought it was an interesting perspective.
You're telling me that chocobos aren't, like, they don't have a Shinto background?
I don't think so.
That's disappointing. But I think, you know, something that you were getting at, you know, you mentioned the corporatism in Final Fantasy VII and, like, the difference between killing God and, like, killing the church. And I think what can be tricky to untangle in terms of the commentary of these games is, like, what exactly is being critiqued, right? Very rarely in JRPGs, at least to me, does it seem to be like, yes, we are talking about the real life Catholic Church and how bad it is specifically. Or we are talking about this real life God that people have a religious belief in and that he should be killed, right? It's like there's like all sorts of different threads, and it can be really hard to parse sort of which is the primary one or if they're all meant to be primary ones, right? Like the most boring of threads is like, well, JRPGs love a climax, and what's more climactic than fighting God, right? So like the most, I won't say boring, like the whole point of it is it's exciting, right? But the most like simplistic thought process in analyzing this, perhaps, is like, well, it's just sort of like the natural progression. If you're fighting a bunch of supernatural stuff, that like it's gonna be God. Like the most powerful thing at the end is God, and like
or the Pope,
or the Pope. Sure. But the, like, you know, is like the big God-like figure. Like the Pope has like God-like powers, right?
Yeah.
Man, Pokemon is this way too, isn't it? Like you...
Yes, you do kill God a lot you catch God, specifically.
Capture God.
You force God into servitude.
Man, somebody write about that. Where's the scholarly writing on the, like, enslavement of God in Pokemon? Goodness gracious. Especially, like, Arceus. Legends Arceus is, like... You are, like, running around collecting Bible verses in that game, too.
Yeah.
Man. That's a whole nother avenue that I wish I didn't even think to look into. Oh, well. Pokemon and God episode coming sometime in the future, perhaps. But I know better than to release a Pokemon episode right now, so we won't talk about that. But, so there's the, like, okay, like, God is exciting avenue. There's the, like a lot of these, I think, have more, or potentially have more thematically to do with, like you said, this idea of, like, fighting predestination and of taking your fate into your own hands. And, like, again, not a critique of, like, not even really necessarily a critique of religion sort of, like, on its own, like, as an element of this, but as, like, the idea of, like, no, like, you and your friends can, like, change the world kind of situation. And then, of course, you know, there's the games that, like, particularly ones that tackle the church, that, again, it's like, is it about the church specifically? Is it more broadly about, like, corrupt institutions? Like, in Persona 5, you do literally fight Yaldabaoth, who is, like, a Gnostic Christian god, like, false god, basically. So it's like, on one hand, it's like, man, doesn't get much more explicit than that. But on the other hand, Persona 5 is, like, all about taking down corrupt institutions. Like, that's, like, the entire game. I mean, it's not the entire game. It's also, like, dating your teacher and going to the movies. But, like...
Well, I think Persona 5 is a really interesting example of this, right? Because, especially when it comes to fighting, like, a god, like a specific one person at the end. Because what is part of my issue with, like, Persona 5 as, like, commentary is you don't take down corrupt institutions, right? You take down one individual within that institution.
Right.
Which does not, in every case, like, dismantle that institution. Like, your school still sucks, even after you kick your gym teacher to the curb, right?
What are you talking about?
The government still sucks, even after you, like, take out the government official or whatever.
I learn one trivia fact a week, every couple weeks in school. I don't know what you're talking about that my school sucks. Chan McDood will not stand for the slander of his alma mater. Anyway,
I did read one, like, pop opinion piece that was, like, there might be some, like, against, like, the collectivist culture idea of, like, one individual using something to make themselves the best, like, using something so that they can get all of the power and become, you know, being selfish in that way. And so in some ways, like, when you take down God, it just, like, there's this one being that wants all of the power for itself, and so you and your teammates, together with the power of friendship, right, take down this one corrupt figure, right? So it's interesting, you know, because you're not really taking down, like, faith. You're just taking down the bad god. And that's sort of how Persona 5 works throughout. You're taking down the bad guy versus, like, dismantling a more greater system.
Yeah. That's a good way to
Does that make sense?
It does. And, you know, to speak in a very broad way, right? Generally, like, East Asian cultures, like, are much more collectivist than the United States. I feel like you can say, like, literally, you can pick any culture and be like, X culture is much more collectivist than the United States.
Yeah.
So, But like they're in particular, and so like that's another element that weaves its way into these stories that is not necessarily like about religion or faith or God specifically. It's more about this idea of like one person rising above all in this way is not like does not fit in nicely with like this idea of how society would work. Which I guess is another reason why we maybe don't see as much of this in Western games media, is like the idea of like a powerful person is not like that a powerful person is like anathema to Japanese culture or anything like that, like obviously. But the idea of this like all-powerful being is much more in line with kind of the American dream generally than with like a more collectivist national identity, which is of course all very generalized, but you know, I mean, I guess, you know, I should give credit where credit is due. You kill a lot of Greek gods. You kill a lot of gods in God of War. Like, he kills like every god. Yeah. So like, you know, I'll say that.
But, you know, Greek gods, that's not real.
Well, do you have much more to say about killing God? Should I move to a different perspective here?
No, we can move on. Yeah. I was really surprised there wasn't a lot about this. I think about it sometimes. Whenever the church comes up in a game I'm playing, I'm like, why is this here? What's this doing?
It's like an easy shorthand, I guess, too. Anyway, I'll go to something a little lighter before we go to, like, representations of Islam and Hinduism in games and how they suck, right? Yeah. But, you know, one thing that is relevant to, you know, Age of Empires, Age of Mythology that we have talked about recently on the show, and that was sort of a partial inspiration for this episode, is that religion is very often a mechanic in simulation games. And there are also a couple of games where you play as a religious leader. So I read a couple of pieces on Cults and Daggers, which came out, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, where you play as, like, it's like sort of a civilization type game, but like very explicitly about spreading religion. You mentioned Cult of Lamb.
That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
Cult of the Lamb. This is going to be so hard for me next week.
That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it does, you know, the line between cult and religion, it's there. But there, you know, any group has the same sort of structure, right?
It's not about religion.
Yeah.
But yeah, like in things like Crusader Kings, in Age of Mythology specifically, in Civilization, religion is a mechanic. So ranging, you know, everything from in Age of Mythology, it's like, well, if you worship Zeus, you get to throw lightning bolts a couple times. And it gives you like this stat buff, right? And you get to pick your minor gods. Or in Civilization, religion, I mean, like most mechanics in Civilization, religion has changed and evolved over the course of the different iterations of the game. There was sort of an interesting article I read that was sort of about, I think it was about like Civ 4 or maybe Civ 3 in that era. No, Civ 4. That was like sort of like, man, like walking through like, here's how we decided to deal with like the math problem. Like, here's how we thought about implementing civilization or religion as a mechanic. And man, that must be really, I mean, I don't know, maybe making a game in like 2005, they didn't feel like as many eyes were on them in the same way as you might if you were adding it to the game now. But they only added it explicitly with Civ 4, even though, you know, obviously there were sort of like elements of it, I think, in the tech tree and that kind of thing before that. But in Civ 4, it's interesting as someone who is primarily a Civ 5 player. In Civ 4, it's like, we picked 7 major world religions, which, like, already, nightmare of a task, right? Already to be like, it's gonna be 7, and here's what they are. And look, I would say that they're, you know, plausibly the 7 major world religions, but, like, also yikes.
Yeah.
Imagine being like, I'm going to work today, and I'm gonna choose the religions that are going to be in my game.
Yeah.
Like, big choice. And then they were like, okay, each religion is going to be linked to a specific technology. So like Hinduism with polytheism, they say in there. And then whoever discovers that technology first founds the religion. And then you would have a holy city, right? And it would have a unique building. It's like so many potentially offensive choices to make. And then, like, also thinking about, like, okay, then what's the mechanic behind the scenes for how that religion spreads, and, like, what benefits does it give you, right? And, like, what the... It's complicated. And I will say Civ 5, I think, steps away from the specific religions meaning anything, basically. Like, it just becomes much more generic. It's not like, yes, it's strategically appropriate for me to decide to found Taoism as opposed to, like, Buddhism or something like that. In Civ 5, it just moves towards, like, this is generic religion, and it has generic benefits. Which I think is probably the right move.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is in Civ 6, but that seems like the safer development choice. But it was interesting to me to even think about, like, even just the idea of religion as a game like mechanic is, like, a little offensive, right? Probably, if you take it seriously. And so, like, what a tricky balancing act, even for games where it's, like, a pretty non-controversial, just, like, you're running a civilization, so, like, religion exists kind of thing. Anyway, let's see. What do we got next? Before I dive into, like, I don't know. Oh, let's talk about localization. Localization is light. I'm, like, giving us, like, a break here in the middle.
Sure.
What's up with religion and localization, Emma?
So, in, like, the 90s, especially, you'll see, like, Nintendo and other games that weren't necessarily on Nintendo had, like, very strict policies when it came to localizing references to, like, God or Satan or just Christianity in general. So if you look into it, you can find a lot of examples where, like, they change, like, a reference to God, or there's, like, a cross in the background because there's a church, and so they get rid of that. I thought it was really funny in Dragon Quest IV, they got rid of the cross and added a pentagram.
I know.
And made the priests shamans. It was so funny to me. And even, like, simple things, like people saying, like, God help me, or whatever, would have to be removed before being translated into English.
Talk about Final Fight. I love Final Fights. It's the funniest thing I've ever read.
Talk about Final Fight, then, if you love it so much.
They changed the localization from somebody, like, presumably getting beaten saying, oh my god. Which, like, look, whatever. Fine, right? But they change it. He's, like, standing in front of, like, a wrecked car, and he says, oh, my car. It's like, no! What? It's so funny. Anyway, I want to read this quote from Nintendo's 1990s content guidelines, just so everyone knows what you would have been working with. So it goes, although exceptions may be made to preserve the context of a game, Nintendo will not approve games for the NES, Game Boy, or Super NES systems, i.e. audio-visual work, packaging, and instruction materials, which, there's a whole long list of stuff. They're like, there can't be drugs, sports can't be, like, more violent than actual sports, and then... which reflect ethnic, racial, religious, nationalistic, or sexual stereotypes of language. Great. Cool. This includes symbols that are related to any racial, religious, nationalistic, or ethnic group, such as crosses, pentagrams, notably, so that one got through, God, gods, parentheses, Roman mythological gods are acceptable, close parentheses, Satan, hell, Buddha.
I don't know if the Dragon Quest example, I don't know if that was on Nintendo or not, or if that was changed independently.
Still
but yeah,
funny.
They let the pentagrams through. I like that specifically Roman.
I know.
What if you were trying to use Greek gods?
That's probably fine.
I assume, when did Kid Icarus come out? But they let that through. So, yeah. I guess Icarus is not a god.
I like that Buddha is there specifically.
Well, in that case, like, you know, Buddhism is a relatively large religion in Japan, I believe. So
It's true, and like Buddha is maybe not like Buddha's not a god, right? Question mark.
I don't think so, but he's certainly an important figure.
I know, but I get it as like someone being like, "Oh, a loophole. You said
Yeah.
God or gods. You didn't say Buddha." Here's the Super Buddha Simulator, where he kicks everyone's butt down a few karmic planes. But it was striking to me how, like, it also just surprised me how many games, like, included crosses in casual ways in the first place. Like, so many of these localization examples that were in these pieces you linked to were like, oh, it's a building that, like, had a cross on top of it because it's a church, and they just, like, removed it, and that kind of thing. It's like, what an interesting choice to make in the first... Like, why did you make that choice in the first place? Why was that there at all?
Well, I guess if it's set in, like, a generally Western fantasy type place, you know?
I get it. It's like, oh man, you've made your life hard for no reason.
I guess so.
Well, should we talk a little bit about how games, so, like, I'll start with Christianity, right? So, like, as we've discussed, games mostly avoid Christianity, I think. Like Emma said, there's plenty of narratives that are, you know, that reference the, like, Jesus story in their structure, or the biblical story in their structure, right? Like, as stories that have been around for thousands of years and are read and familiar to a lot of people, that makes sense. But there's really very, very few, other than, I mean, maybe, you know, Pentiment, I guess, now, but other than, like, Assassin's Creed, which is very much, like, historical representations.
I mean, so is Pentiment, just pointing that out.
I know, fair enough. Sorry, I just mean, like, you know, there's not very many examples. I can't really think of any examples of games that are set even in vaguely modern day that represent it, even, like, casually, right? This came up in, so we'll talk about Islam's representation in games shortly, but in one of the panels, somebody mentioned, like, you know, the idea of, like, Islamic characters or Muslim characters in games, like, being portrayed in, like, very stereotypical ways, and they're like, you would never think about, like, you're a Christian character, like, what does a Christian look like? And I was like, true, I hear your point, but, like, I cannot think of a single Christian character.
Well, I mean, I think it's because it's, like, that's the assumed default, right? If you're playing, like, I play The Last of Us, and I'm not like, these characters are actively delicious, but, like, Joel was Christian, you know?
But, like, you read that because he's clearly from the American South, right? Like, I would buy an interpretation of Joel where he's, like, a staunch atheist, too, because of everything he's been through.
I guess so.
And, I mean, that would, in some ways, to me, read given the end of the game. Like, he doesn't believe there's any... If he believed in an afterlife, maybe a different choice would be made. And that's a real stretch, right? I'm just saying.
Write a paper on that. Is Joel a Christian in The Last of Us?
Is The Last of Us really an extended Abraham and Isaac, like, metaphor? There's the paper. But like, you're reading that 'cause it's like Joel is, like, from, like, Texas or whatever, right? So it's like, of course. I guess so. And so, like, I hear that. But, like, it would have been really easy for that game to, like, include more explicit references to that if they'd wanted to. It wouldn't have seemed out of place,
sure,
I think. And they still don't. And, like, there are plenty of games where it's like, it wouldn't seem out of place for these characters to be like, help me, God. Like, I'm killing a bunch of zombies. Like, please protect me. And they don't. Right? So it's, you know. Not that, like, if that was thrown in, there'd be plenty of people that are like, this is unnecessary. But, you know, as games become these more, like, these characters with more fleshed out backstories, whether or not that's, like, that impactful on the, like, broader narrative, it's striking that, I mean, it's not just Christianity. It's like most modern games don't really feature anyone who's like a noticeable believer. I don't know. There's probably some like badass priests somewhere in some kind of zombie game. I guess. I'm sure probably. That exists, but that's like not even. That doesn't even count, right?
Let's see. I can't remember if it's a Catholic orphanage that Nathan Drake is in Uncharted. I do not remember if they were nuns or not. It is gone from my memory.
Yeah.
And I played Amori this year, which they live in like a little small American town and have a church that they go to. That has like the graveyard behind it and a pastor and stuff. That's the only examples I can think of, and I'm not sure on the Uncharted one. I would not read Nathan Drake as practicing religion, but in terms of like there being religious representation, I think it's a Catholic orphanage, but I'm not sure.
I feel like Nathan Drake probably has to go to confession. I killed another 100 people on my dumb treasure hunting trip. But anyway, if representation of Christianity and Judeo-Christian tradition generally is more or less absent from explicit depiction in games, depiction of characters who are Muslim and to a lesser, to a, I don't know, like less culturally saturated extent, but still potentially troubling extent, like Hinduism, are more common in games.
Well, I think it's some of it's wrapped up in like our cultural perception, especially of Islam, is just like it's the same as Middle East, right?
Yeah.
The Middle East is Islam. And like there's like that's just how we've learned to sort of perceive it in our heads, and that's how we portray it in games, right? You go to any Middle Eastern country and it all looks the same in the way that it's portrayed in the video game because it's Islam, when that is in fact not how countries work.
So I think at the heart, well, not at the heart, but one of the many things at the heart of some of this is just a complete lack of care and lack of research and lack of thought. So I'll do the Hinduism examples first, because they're like a little more surface level, I think, right? So like Fallout 3 was pulled from India because they had two-headed mutant cows that they called Brahmin, which is both like the name of like the priest social class in India, and like Brahman is also a word for some of their sacred cows. They had these two-headed mutant cows that they called that, and it's like, okay, somebody knew the joke they were making there, and like to what end?
Yeah.
Right? This one is like maybe a little bit less the lack of care, but like the first game fully developed by an Indian team, which was apparently awful, by the way. It's called Hanuman Boy Warrior, which was sort of controversial because Hanuman is the character from the Ramayana. It's like I am Jesus Christ, basically. So that's a little different. But then there was this MOBA. I've now forgotten what the Smite, which included like Hindu deities as characters. And like people spoke out against that, and I really enjoyed the quote. Like maybe it's probably wrong to include these deities in this like casual way when no doubt no one on the team was of a faith where they could be like, at least be like for them personally, like this is okay. But I do really appreciate the quote from the lead developer where like somebody asked them like, okay, so like you've got Hindu gods, so like are you gonna, do you plan to put like Abraham in the game, right? Will you have like stuff from the Judeo-Christian Islamic religions? And the developer says that they have a diverse staff, but that the Abrahamic figures were not included mostly for gameplay reasons. He says, this tradition does not have stories about deities fighting one another with, quote, awesome abilities. From the perspective of a video game, the key Abrahamic figures, Adam, Noah, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, are not that interesting in character design or gameplay. They are all human. They never overlapped or interacted with one another. They certainly never fought each other in dramatic fashion with unique abilities. They are all peaceful. At best, they would be support characters.
I think they should have talked to the developers of I Am Jesus Christ about that.
Seriously.
I read that quote, I was reminded, when it was Radiant Historia's episode, right, where you're like, why do they always talk about silhouette? And it's like, yeah, all these Abrahamic figures would in fact have the same silhouette. They're not good character designs, you know?
They're just not thinking big enough. Think of what Adam's rib. I feel like Adam's rib, like there's an ability there.
Like coming out of him?
Yeah. Like pulls it out, it can turn into Eve.
Throws the lady at you.
I feel like not that no one would ever. I think there was actually a Flash game that was basically Super Smash, but with like religious characters. But like, look, there's potential there. I'm just saying, don't ever make it. It'll probably be bad, but you know, the next PlayStation All-Stars.
Yeah.
But anyway, to talk about like a more broadly, in some ways, it's weird to say this, but like Islam is probably the religion that is the most represented in video games.
Yeah.
Which is deeply alarming.
I think the issue is, and we don't have to go too deep on this, we did an episode about the military and games before, but like the way that the games they're represented in are military games.
Yeah.
And our modern military interventions have all been in, you know, Middle Eastern areas. And so when they're portraying military guys being cool, you know where they're doing it. And because, you know, those are paid for by the military, we're not gonna show the military guys not being cool. I mean, come on. And so, of course, all of your enemies are, you know, Arabic, Islamic, Middle Eastern people that you have to fight because they're evil, you know. And I think that's where a lot of the problem comes from, because of their fundamental existence as military games. They cannot portray it any other way.
And then, like, even beyond that, there are so many examples of just, like, who okayed this? Kind of, or, like, how did this get through? Kind of.
Well, the example that we saw of, like, they had pages of the Quran on the floor that you could step on, and like bloody and stuff, and people were very upset about that. I think the reason it got through is they just didn't think about it. Like, and if you're not, you know, religious yourself, like I'd be like, if I was in a game and there were like pages of the Bible on the floor, like that's not something that would bother me, right? And so I think that probably it got through because they were just applying that thought process to any other religion that's out there. When in fact, you should not do that and instead should ask someone.
It's just astonishing. Because it's like, it should have been like a 2-minute trailer. It's like, did no one on the comms team go like, hey, wait a minute. Why is this what we're highlighting? Like, beyond like it being a bad idea to include in the game in general, it's like just like a weird thing to be like, yes, here's the game, here's what I want to show you about the game, you're stepping on the pages of the Quran.
Yeah, that's fair. It is a bad, yeah,
like it's just so stupid on so many, it's just unbelievable to me. I don't know, I take for granted how like woke the theater industry is, I think, a lot of the time, and like it's just like, I don't know, like I don't think
I tend to think that the video game industry is pretty conservative. I
guess if you're working on Call of Duty,
Well, I don't know if there's probably individual developers that are all sorts of things, but in terms of leadership positions, and general story paths, like friendship, compassion, whatever. But ultimately, a lot of video game stories are pretty conservative.
Fair enough.
And we still have, like, the basics, putting some white LGBTQ plus characters in games. We can't do that yet. How are we supposed to do, like, race?
Yeah.
How are we supposed to deal with different races?
It does present a real problem, I think, for Muslim representation in general in games. That it's like, okay, like, like the industry has decided that the representation is like guys in traditional dress who are your enemies in Call of Duty games, and like women in like full hijab, right? Yeah. But because there is like no representation of like for any religion, right, in like modern games like that take place in more like not in Call of Duty's like generic Middle East setting, right, in like a Western modern setting, because in those games there is like essentially no depiction of religion, like it does make you sort of like despair for anything being better. Like this is like something they talk, like you shared this panel with these like various Muslim like game developers and journalists like talking about this issue, and like what they talk about is like, not everyone who's Muslim is Arabic. Even if they are Arabic, they don't necessarily dress the specific way. Like Indonesia has like the largest like population of Muslims. You never see that, right? Like there's all sorts of variety even within a given country. And of course the problem is that like the depiction that's the stereotype is there, but games that would depict something that isn't the stereotype like don't do that.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, like, it feels like a very different conundrum than the question of representation in, like, film or in television or something like that, where, pick any given thing that is, like, a representation issue in that medium, and it's like, well, like, there are, like, stories about that, though. Like, those characters do exist in stories somewhere. They're not getting platformed the way they should be, but, like there are characters that are religious in TV and in film, perhaps even more in film. Like there are characters that like have different, like have disabilities, and there are characters that are of different races, right? And like those are stories that can be told. And in games it's like, I think especially like with religion, it's like, well, there's just like not really a history of that at all. Like it's a little bit sad that it's like Altair in Assassin's Creed is like the positive Muslim representation. Because, like, dude is an assassin.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We should probably wrap it up, but the last, like, light point I want to talk about is I read a little bit about, like, post-apocalyptic games and its trend of, like, using deifying technology basically when it comes to making up religions. So they use like Fallout 3 has like a religion that worships like an unexploded atom bomb, which it's a big thing that's ununderstandable at this point. There's a spark of danger, but it's awe-inspiring too. It's like, yeah, okay, I can see how someone could make a religion around that. And then Horizon Zero Dawn, which you could talk about a lot with Horizon Zero Dawn in terms of how it does its post-apocalypse, I think. But they have like religions in which that are just AI, even though they aren't aware of that. Like all of their like spirituality is based on former humans' stuff left behind that they worship and have like pieces of technology that they use. Or you have stuff like Nier Automata, where humans are the god, right? Even the stuff like machines have Adam and Eve, but they're getting that from reading human books, right? That's why they named themselves that, not because they were innately born that way. And androids also are using humans as a way to like inspire them. They're doing this for humans, it's like a holy war type situation. And so it's interesting in terms of like imagining a post-apocalypse and like the ruins of what we left and how that might end up being something that's ununderstandable, right? Like our pieces of technology that we leave behind. And when we don't understand something, it's either very scary or we really love it, you know? Or we're like, that's cool. You're God now. That's sort of human history, right?
That's cool. You're God now.
Yeah. That's what we did with, like, nature and stuff. That's where the Greek myths and all the stuff, the nature gods come from, right? You're like, thunder. Ah, that's cool. You're God now. Right? It's very pure of us, I think.
How confused would the people of Horizon be to discover, like, SimCity?
Yeah.
Blow up there, the Matrix, Horizon Zero Dawn.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, did we miss any major examples of religion in games? The answer to that is yes. I think you could do an entire podcast on, like, just Assassin's Creed's depiction of, like, any of these games that we talked about. I feel like you could do an entire podcast just on, like, that one specific game's depiction of religion. We didn't even talk about, like, burning down churches in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, or the article I found about how you could play a Christian playthrough of Assassin's Creed Origins, which was fascinating. I was gonna say hilarious, but let's say fascinating. Do you, like, think that there are ways that games should or could be, incorporating religion into their stories? Are you offended by this entire episode and, like, shocked that we would even talk about this? You're not, but do you want to?
You should check out I Am Jesus Christ.
Coming, they say coming holiday 2022. The demo is out there. But if you're offended by this episode, I actually think you're going to be offended by I Am Jesus Christ. Like, I really do.
There's nothing offensive in I Am Jesus Christ. That's what happened. That's what Jesus did. He shot lasers at Satan.
You know what? Emma is the one with the religious studies minor, not me. So
I was like, no, I'm not.
I'm just kidding.
Don't lie to the listeners.
I didn't talk about myth making once here, so you're welcome, listeners. Anyway, if you enjoyed the episode or not, well, mostly if you enjoyed the episode, you should follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you could read all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat for our main episodes, and read our blog featuring soon. What was the blog I said you were going to write? I've already forgotten.
I don't remember.
It was something as a Jesus game. Fire Emblem is a Jesus game.
Oh yeah, Fire Emblem Three Houses, the Jesus story.
But I'll add the Pokemon blog. I want Pokemon as a, like, what are the thematic meanings of enslaving God? And, like, aren't Pokemon all just little anyway, I'm gonna stop. Check out the blog. Finally, if you enjoy the show, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, anywhere that you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. You can probably subscribe to Talk This. Next week, it is Cult of the Lamb, right? Which I really did not have in mind when I picked this. I wish I could say, like, yes, I prepared for religious games because we're talking about Cult of the Lamb, but I had totally forgotten about that until you wrote it down somewhere. But I don't remember what the other game is.
Sleeping Dogs.
Sleeping Dogs. That could be about religion too, for all I know. I don't know what that one is about.
I think it's about the Chinese mafia.
There you go. So tune in for that next
week.
Don't
say there you go. That's not about religion.
I just said there you go, like that's what it's about, not that it's about religion. Anyway, tune in for that next week. In 2 weeks for Emma's side quest. We need to put our heads together on the Talk This holiday programming schedule, because at some point we'll have our, like, what we played this year recap. I gotta finish some games, people. But that'll be coming closer to the end of the year. So listeners, that's it for our show. Emma, do you have a good sign off?
This week, I hope that your Holy Spirit power stays filled.